Hi class, let's talk about forgetting. So first of all, what I want to do is think about things that we think we remember really well, but we probably actually forgot some of it. And this is the idea of flashbulb memories. Flashbulb memories are those super vivid memories you have that feel like they're more accurate than normal because they were for something that was a really huge event in your life. A lot of us have flashbulb memories for big national events. So people who were alive in 1941 remember Pearl Harbor. In 1963, they remembered where they were and what they were doing when they heard about Kennedy's assassination. I was a middle schooler in 1986, and I have a flashbulb memory for the Challenger disaster. They had lined up all the little kids, and we were in our classrooms, and we were watching the Challenger launch. There was a teacher who was on board, Krista McAuliffe, and so all of the schools were showing us the Challenger launch live. And we all watched it live blow up and all of the people die. And I have a flashbulb memory of the situation of the classroom. I remember where I was sitting. I can see all of the desks and all of the rows and all the people. I can see the teacher's desk. I can see the teacher standing there and the cart that the TV was on. I also have one for 9/11, the dumpy apartment that I lived in when I was in graduate school in 2001, and the ugly brown carpet. I have one for my 6th birthday party. This was a huge deal to me. I had finally gotten what I had long wanted, which was a Barbie doll cake. You know, those where they'll stick the Barbie doll, she'll be standing up, and then the cake is actually her dress. So we were just, back in those days, nobody had parties at like bounce houses. We didn't do expensive things like that. We went in the backyard and we had sack races. But my parents splurged on this Barbie doll cake, and it was sitting on the edge of the picnic table, and somebody bumped the picnic table. And that beautiful Barbie doll cake started to fall off the edge, and it was going to crash into the grass. And I have a flashbulb memory of my dad in his standard white shirt with his camera around his neck and his big hand reaching out and just in the nick of time catching the cake in his hand, and all of that beautiful blue frosting that made up her dress went all over his hand. But he saved the day and we ate what we could of the cake. So I don't know what your flashbulb memories will be like. A lot of you may be too young, are probably too young to you probably weren't even born yet, is my guess, many of you, in 2001. But I wonder if coronavirus is going to be your flashbulb memory, if you're going to remember when it finally hit you, that this was a very different time, that the world was significantly changing. The thing about flashbulb memories is that we think that they're really vivid and really accurate. They tend actually not to be. Research demonstrates that they do in fact decay over time, and they're not necessarily more accurate than memories for more common events. Of course, the most striking case of forgetting is amnesia. And amnesia can result from either a physical or a psychological condition. If you get a bad enough bump on the head, that can cause amnesia. If you are sufficiently stressed, that can cause amnesia. So, for example, you might forget some horrible event that happened to you. You might forget entirely who you are. We'll talk about some of those kinds of things when we do the psych disorders chapter. There are 2 different types and degrees of amnesia. There's anterograde and retrograde. And this is a good kind of test question, so I want you guys to try to get this into your mind. So retro, you've used that word before. Oh, that's so retro, right? And what do you mean by that? You mean that it's old. You know, the 70s is retro. If I wear bell bottoms and, I don't know, tie-dye, that's retro. That's old. So retrograde amnesia means that you can't retrieve your old memories. You can form new memories, but you can't get those old memories. Anterograde is the opposite. You've got your old memories, but you can't form the new ones. Okay? So antero means after and retro means before. So retrograde, you can't retrieve old memories. Anterograde, you can't form new. Now, retrieval and forgetting has a very interesting feature. Context matters when it comes to our memories, and we call this the encoding specificity principle. This is the work of Godden and Badley. So they did some really cool research. They asked people to learn words in two different contexts, underwater or on dry land. And you can see what happened here. If you learned on land, okay, and you retrieved on land, this was the same context and you tended to remember pretty well. If you learned underwater and retrieved underwater, you tended to retrieve pretty well. Now notice that this is lower than this, and I don't know if that's statistically significant or not, but doesn't it make sense that we would remember better if we learned and retrieved on land, because most of us don't do this kind of thing? Well, look at this. If you learn on land and retrieve underwater, you don't do nearly as well. If you learn underwater and retrieve on land, you don't do nearly as well. So context matters. Now, does this matter in real life? Well, yeah, it does. When you go to university, if you're like me, you'll have some really big classes. My child psych and gen psych classes were in huge lecture halls with hundreds and hundreds of students for lecture. And then we would have a discussion section in a different room where there was maybe 20 people in there. And we would take our tests in there in the discussion section. So we were learning a lot of our material in the lecture hall and retrieving it in our discussion section room. Those are different contexts. Could that have affected scores? Absolutely, according to Godden and Badley's encoding specificity principle. Now, there's also, mood also plays a role when it comes to remembering and forgetting. Memory is facilitated by having both physiological conditions, so land versus water, lecture hall versus discussion room, and psychological conditions being the same at the time of encoding and retrieval. This is called mood congruence. Retrieval is easier if the content of the memory corresponds to the present emotional state. So what does that tell you? Well, it tells you that if you're currently sad, much easier to remember sad stuff that happened to you. If you're currently happy, much easier to remember happy stuff that happened to you. Okay? So this is part of the reason why people who are depressed need to be on guard to not indulge in the negative memories and thoughts that bubble up. Because of course they're going to bubble up, because we know that from mood congruence theory. If you are currently, if you're currently feeling sad, be on guard for those sad memories that might pop up. Okay, let's think about one of the biggest ideas in forgetting, and this is Hermann Ebbinghaus and his famous Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. That's what we're looking at right here, the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. So he was a funny guy. He was interested in studying forgetting, and he would use nonsense syllables like this. Okay, we don't use any of these in our language. He would try to memorize a bunch of these, and then he was his own test subject, and then he would try to produce them, and he would test himself over a period of time. So after 20 minutes, an hour, 8 hours, 24 hours, and then a series of days, 2 days, 6 days, and 31 days. So what this shows us is that there's initially, from the time that we learn something, within the first 20 minutes, there's a huge drop-off in our forgetting. So, when you're in class, right? This is that kind of situation. You're learning stuff in class, and then within 20 minutes, you've forgotten quite a bit of it. That's why it's a good idea after class to review your notes. An hour later, you can see that there's more of a drop-off. After 8 hours, more drop-off. And then right around here, it seems to kind of taper out. After about a day, there's still some forgetting, okay? But considering that this is a long period of time, the scale here is really long, this is a pretty flat decline, okay? Not much decline. So if you can remember it for 24 hours, there's a good chance that you're going to remember it even longer. So that should tell you within the first 24 hours of a class, you should be reviewing those notes and trying to make sure that encoding continues to still happen. Okay. How many times would you need to see an item to be able to remember it, do you think? 5 times? 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times? If I showed you something and you saw it 100 times, would you remember it? Well, let me ask you this. How much experience do you have handling money? How many times have you seen a penny? Probably 1,000, right? Well, let's see. try this. Look at the 10 pennies here. Which one is a real penny? One of these is correct, and the rest of them are wrong. Anybody know what it is? If you guessed F, you were correct. And if you guessed F, you're one of only a handful in each of my 30-person classes who ever gets this right. Almost everybody gets it wrong. Now, you've all seen it a million times, haven't you? You've seen it, and yet you didn't remember. And the reason you didn't remember is because you never actually encoded it to begin with. You never actually encoded it. Now let's think about why we forget things. So you didn't remember the penny because you never bothered to encode what a penny actually looks like. And why did you not do that? Because you don't need to. You don't need to have that information. You can recognize a penny. So there's two ideas about why we forget. One is decay theory and one is interference theory. Decay theory is the idea that when a new memory is formed, it creates a memory trace, some kind of a distinct structural or chemical change in the brain. But over time, if it's not used, that memory trace fades away as a matter of normal brain processes. Now, there's a little bit of an issue here, right? Not everything fades away. Some information can be remembered decades after it was originally learned. Now, you've probably experienced this before, interference theory. This is where something new interferes with something you knew before. So there are two types, retroactive and proactive. Retroactive, remember retro means before, so a new memory interferes with remembering old information. So I'll bet you know your current phone number, but do you remember your phone number from like 2 times ago? Do you remember your old phone number? Probably not, because the new phone number interfered with the old phone number. Proactive interference is where old memory interferes with new information. So memories of where you parked your car on campus last week interferes with your ability to find your car today. That's why I always park in the same basic spot when I go to Walmart or Kroger. Okay, that's it for forgetting. We'll see you next for false memory.